Hey everyone, Lauren again at Mill City Roasters. Today I want to talk about decaf. We have a little bit of a problem in our industry, and I think it starts with a common phrase. Maybe you've heard this term, maybe it's new to you. People like to put it on stickers or t-shirts where they say, death before decaf, right? I would never drink a decaf coffee. I'm a real coffee person, and I only drink real coffee, caffeinated coffee. I kind of reject that idea, and I want to convince you to come on board with me and join the decaf party. There are a lot of reasons that people associate decaf with not great coffee. And historically, some of those reasons have been real. Way back when, several decades ago, there was really only one way to decaffeinate coffee. It was a chemical process that was direct, it was harsh, and it left the coffee tasting pretty awful. Decaf coffees that were decaffeinated using chemicals kind of tasted like hairspray or rubbing alcohol. You could probably still find some of these coffees at your grocery store or gas station if you go to buy the cheapest decaf that you can find, maybe in a big tub that's pre-ground. You can have that experience too of having a really, really bad decaf. For a long time, that was the only option that existed for people who had to drink decaf. Nowadays, we have better choices, but still, people aren't roasting great decaf, and not a lot of people are drinking great decaf because they don't have access to it. Let's talk about some of the reasons that we as roasters are not doing a good job giving excellent decaf to our customers. The first reason makes total sense. It's because our decaf drinkers are not the majority of our customers. So when I worked in cafes, I remember that really only anywhere from 15 to 20% of my daily customers were ordering decaf, whether that was in their espresso drinks or in their drip coffee. And some of those were half decaf, so half caffeinated, half decaf. If our customers aren't demanding a high amount of decaf, then we, as roasters, aren't going to roast a lot of it. That means that the green decaf that we buy might sit around in our roastery for a little longer, and it might get a little stale or show signs of age, but we still need to get through it because we paid good money for it. So bad decaf can start there with old greens or out of season greens. The same thing happens with roasted coffee. Say I'm a cafe manager and I'm making my weekly order. Maybe I'm only ordering decaf once every 2 or 3 or 4 weeks because, again, I don't go through it that fast. Maybe my roastery only sells a minimum of 5 pounds at a time, and it takes me forever to go through those 5 pounds. So instead of cutting my losses and just throwing out that old decaf, I just hang on to it and I use it. In this situation, my decaf customers are getting old roasted coffee that's, again, it's gone stale, it's really lost its legs, and it's really lost its flavor. The last problem happens in the cafes. Now, I'm not trying to say anything negative about baristas. I used to be a barista for a really long time, but baristas are more concerned with keeping coffees dial in that are getting ordered all the time. So when they come in to work on the espresso bar or the pour-over bar, they're checking their parameters, their specs, for their house espresso, their single origin espresso, and all their other brewed coffees. The decaf, it gets kind of put on the back burner. Maybe you only get a couple orders for decaf throughout the morning shift or the afternoon shift, and every time you go back to that grinder, you go, oh, it's been hours since I pulled a shot of decaf. I don't know if my parameters are still good. I'm not going to dial it in again. I'm just going to pull this shot and hope for the best. In all of these scenarios, our decaf drinkers are kind of getting shafted. They're getting coffees that we're not really thinking a lot about, we're not giving a lot of care and attention, and then they're having a bad experience. This perpetuates the cycle, this idea that decaf isn't good. You know, death before decaf. I would rather drink nothing than have to drink decaf coffee. The other sort of elephant in the room is that decaf coffees can be hard to roast. Some of them look a little unusual. They look darker than green coffee typically looks. They have different moisture contents. It's hard to figure out a profile for them. They don't respond to heat the same way that regular coffee does. And so maybe we're doing our best to really roast great decaf, but it's just not working because we don't get a lot of experience with it. I want to do a video series about decaf because I love my decaf drinkers. People drink decaf for all kinds of reasons, right? It's not just people who are pregnant, although that's a lot of them, right? People who are pregnant are told to stay away from caffeine or minimize caffeine content, so they end up drinking decaf. There are specific medications, there are specific medical situations that require you to stay away from caffeine, that interfere with medications. Some people who are just prone to high anxiety or difficulty sleeping might have to avoid decaf. There could be really a ton of different reasons. For me, I have to stop drinking caffeine at, it seems like earlier and earlier these days. Usually about 2 o'clock is like a hard cutoff. And all of us probably really like coffee. When I used to do barista training, I had a whole spiel about this where I said, look, our decaf drinkers are in many ways our biggest coffee fans. These are people who drink coffee not for the caffeine, not for the effect, the stimulation, the awakening effect that it has on us, but because they love the flavor of coffee. More than that, maybe the same amount of that, they love the experience. They love the ritual of brewing a cup of coffee for themselves or for friends. They love sitting with a hot cup of coffee to do their work, to do some reading, to talk to someone. They love meeting friends in cafes and coffee shops and ordering something delicious and beautiful that they can't make for themselves at home. They're opting for decaf because they have to or they choose to, and they're getting a subpar experience, and that's not their fault. If you look around the specialty beverage industry right now, there's a huge growing movement. That movement is the non-alcoholic movement. And for a lot of the same reasons that I've just explained why our decaf drinkers can't drink caffeinated coffee, there's a lot of people out there who really love beers, wines, spirits, and cocktails, and they just are trying to avoid alcohol. This is one of the fastest growing markets in craft beverages, and people who are getting on board with really nice NA beers and spirit-free cocktails are making a ton of money. So if you don't take anything else away from this video series, I'd like you to take away this. If you pay attention to your decaf a little bit more, and if you highlight some really delicious decafs on your menu, you too can make a little bit more money. And I think that maybe for some of us, that's the end goal. So what if this happened? What if we all started sourcing great decafs, paying more attention to them at the roastery, highlighting them and recommending them to guests or to customers, and getting our baristas and our people who are at the cafe level excited to taste them and to brew them? What if that happened, and what if everyone who has to drink decaf starts to get the same experience that our caffeinated customers get, which is a product that's given so much care and so much attention and so much time, and you can really taste that in the end cup? I would love that. In this video series, I'm going to do some roasting. I know, it's a big deal. You guys don't see me roast a lot. I'm still pretty new at it. But what I did was I pulled 3 decafs that are in our roastery, and I sample roasted them. I took some notes. I developed some profiles, and then I profile roasted them. I'm going to do 3 subsequent videos that are going to be decaf roast-alongs. I'm going to talk about how I developed the profile, what I like about the coffee as a sample roast, and what I'm trying to highlight or showcase in these profile roasts. I'm going to talk about these coffees just like they're regular, beautiful, single-origin coffees, because they are. And I'll talk a little bit about the techniques that we employ here when we roast decafs and what we watch out for and some of the workarounds that typically help me with decaf in the roaster when it gets to be a little bit more difficult. The coffees that I'm going to roast are a Decaf Mexico from the Oaxaca region. It's a mountain water processed Mexico coffee. I'm going to also roast 2 EA processed Colombias. Now, a lot of us have heard Swiss water or mountain water. Maybe some of us have heard the term EA decaf or sugarcane decaf. If you haven't heard about these terms, that's okay. If you have, but you're not quite sure what they mean, let's get into it. I would like to explain how these decaffeination methods work. So, at the start of this video, I talked about the old way of decaffeinating coffee, which is kind of gross. Really harsh chemicals, solvents were sprayed onto coffee, or coffee was soaked in them, and those solvents pulled out caffeine, and then the coffee was rinsed and then dried and then gone to roast. And again, that left a lot of residual chemical flavor on those coffees. And that process was fairly inexpensive, because when you process coffee that way and you extract caffeine using chemical solvents, you get to keep the caffeine. You get to sell that caffeine. And lots of people want to buy caffeine, especially people in the pharmaceutical industry, energy beverages, supplement companies. Caffeine is a pretty cool commodity, and if you are willing to spend a lot of money on caffeine, then you don't really care what happens to that coffee after the caffeine has been removed. In those older processing methods, a lot of companies made more money on the caffeine that they sold than the coffee that they decaffeinated, which is another reason that that coffee was not so great. In these newer processes, they're a lot more complicated. They take a lot more time. They take a lot more money and investment. And you can't always harvest the caffeine when you're done with it. So what does that mean? The coffee better be good, right? Because that's what you're going to sell. So we're going to start with the first method, which is water processing. You may have heard the term mountain water process or Swiss water process. These are brand names. Swiss Water is a company based in Canada, and Mountain Water is a company based in Mexico. Now, the Mountain Water process and the Swiss Water process are both proprietary. So that means we're not going to have all of the exact measurements and times and all of that stuff. But very, very loosely, I can tell you what's happening. So imagine a long, long time ago, someone took a bunch of green coffee, this is my green coffee bean in here, and put it in a tank of clean water. They brought that water up to a lukewarm or warm temperature level and let that coffee steep. Now, what kind of bled out of the beans into the water was caffeine, we'll mark that here with a C, and flavor, we'll mark that here with an F. All of that caffeine and the flavor comes out into the water until the coffee beans are totally empty. They don't have anything left in them. They're just cellulose and plant fibers. That original batch of coffee beans had to, unfortunately, get thrown out. But just one time. This is not a wasteful process. What we've created here in this tank now is called GCE, or green coffee extract. It's basically supercharged water with caffeine and coffee flavor. That water is then passed through carbon filters. Think about big tower filters that are sort of like what's inside your Brita. And the caffeine molecules, which are really big, get stuck. So those are the caffeines getting trapped in our filter. What comes out the other end is just the flavor-charged water. Now this is where the science comes in. You take unprocessed, new green coffee and drop it into this flavor water, and through a process called osmosis, everything wants to be drawn out again. This coffee is full of caffeine, but it's also still full of flavor because it's brand new and hasn't been processed yet. There's a law in science called the law of saturation, which means that once a solution has reached its peak amount of saturation, it can't saturate anymore. It can't extract anything else. This happens if you put sugar cubes into a cup of tea. Eventually, after you put a lot of them in there, the last one that you put in there won't melt because that water is full of sugar and it can't absorb any more sugar. Now this water is full of flavor and it can't absorb any more flavor. But what is it missing? It's missing our caffeine. So it's the water itself that pulls the caffeine out, taking it out of the coffee, and it's a natural way to decaffeinate coffee. What we are left with is coffee that's full of flavor and no caffeine. This water, again, can be recycled back through the filter. So we only had to kind of create that GCE one time. This is a method that is, for Swiss water at least, organic. For both of these processes, Mountain and Swiss, totally chemical-free, and it decaffeinates up to 99.9% of coffee, so it takes almost all the caffeine out of it. The only drawback is you can't harvest caffeine from these filters. They get incinerated. And so the coffee better be good, and it is. If you look on a bag or a label and you see water process, you know this is going to be coffee that really tastes like the origin, where it was grown, and hopefully the skill of the roaster who roasted it, and it's not going to have any chemical flavor because we didn't use any chemicals here. This is a method that I'm very familiar with. I've been serving and brewing decaf processed this way for many, many years, and I always love it and recommend it. The hot new method that's just hit the market within the past few years It's called EA, ethyl acetate, sometimes called sugarcane decaffeination. Now this again, we kind of have to put on our science hats to think about, but it's pretty simple. EA stands for ethyl acetate, which is a naturally occurring ester. You can harvest it from bananas or from fermented sugarcane. This is my drawing of sugarcane. If you can extract ethyl acetate out of these things, then you can use it to decaffeinate coffee. First, green coffee is taken and it's steamed, almost like it's put in a sauna or a very fancy spa. When you steam something like coffee, the pores open up. It becomes more porous and it becomes easier to absorb things. So we end up with coffee that has these nice big open pores after about 30 minutes of steaming. Then we take a solution of ethyl acetate and water, H2O, and we submerge the coffee in that solution. The ethyl acetate actually bonds to salts of chlorogenic acid is how caffeine represents in coffee. That's how it's sort of bonded as a chemical compound in coffee. So the ethyl acetate bonds to the salts of chlorogenic acid, the caffeine molecules, and after that bond has happened, the coffee can then just be rinsed with water. And as we rinse that solution away from the coffee, the caffeine comes away as well. Rinse and rinse and rinse until there's no more caffeine detected in the coffee, and then the coffee gets dried and polished, which is a process to just make sure that it's totally ready to be roasted again, and it's back to the moisture level that we want to see green coffee at. Because ethyl acetate is a naturally occurring ester, this is also a totally natural and in many cases organic process. It leaves the decaf coffee tasting beautiful and delicious, just like the origin where it was grown. Our Colombia coffees that I'm going to be roasting are both processed using EA method. One of them is sweet and fruity and super tropical. It has all of those tasting notes that we like out of Colombia: pineapple, cherries, Jolly Rancher, fruit punch. It's really interesting and fun and dynamic. I think it's the decaf coffee that could convince all specialty drinkers to drink more decaf. The other EA Colombia is a little bit more interesting and savory and earthy. It has chocolate and spice and molasses, but it also has some like cool sweet tomato and dark chocolate notes. I think it's a real good crowd-pleasing decaf, and I think that it is really good at a solid medium roast profile. The mountain water processed decaf that I'm going to roast and demonstrate is from Mexico. It is one of my favorite coffees that I've had in a long time. It is really sweet and nutty. It tastes like cheesecake and flan and caramel. It has all these really nice buttery, toasted, caramelized flavors, and I think it's nice at a medium or a dark level. This is going to be the coffee that our general kind of coffee audience is really drawn towards, and would be a great like holiday decaf or after dinner decaf, something to go with your dessert. Now, I kind of mentioned this already, but what would happen if we added great coffee, great decaf coffee to our menus? There's tons of application for it. Decaf coffee doesn't just have to be an alternative for people who don't want to have caffeine. There's so many ways that we can incorporate decaf into our menus and highlight it and get more people excited about it. For instance, you could put a great decaf on your pour-over menu right up next to your awesome single origins. Just in the same way that those NA cocktail menus and mocktails and spirit-free menus are showing up in restaurants, people get excited to say, oh, I was going to have a cup of coffee, but you're right, it is a little late in the day. Maybe I'll try that decaf pour-over. That sounds awesome. Especially if you have some really beautiful tasting notes to go along with it, I would order that in a heartbeat. Another thing that you can do to highlight great decafs is to serve a half-calf blend or do a retail package of half caffeinated and half decaf coffee. Pairing two coffees from the same origin, like a Colombia, would be a really cool way to sell a still single origin coffee that's half decaffeinated. I had never really seen half decaf retail bags myself until I moved to the Midwest, but now that I see them in cafes, I think that's a great idea. You can play around with fun names, blend names for them, and again, kind of unlock a whole new market of people who are kind of caffeine sensitive or have to sort of watch their caffeine intake. One of the reasons that I always keep decaf coffee at home is to cook with it or bake with it. We have recipes at home for dark chocolate cake and brownies that incorporate a little bit of coffee as one of the sort of raw ingredients. And I don't want to necessarily get caffeinated from having a slice of cake. So I reach for a decaf coffee and brew a little mocha pot or AeroPress, something really concentrated that tastes very strongly of coffee, and I use that in the recipe. The last reason I have decaf coffee at home, well, aside from just drinking it in the afternoon or evening, is because I make my own coffee liqueur with it. Around the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas, I like to make something that is almost like a Bailey's that I can have with cream or with coconut cream or with my dessert or in other cocktails like a White Russian, but I don't want it to have caffeine. So I've made a version of that over the years with a really, really nice decaf. There are tons of other applications. You could brew a cold brew concentrate with decaf and add it into shakes and smoothies. I put a shot of coffee in a protein shake last weekend and totally blew my mind with how good it was. So I want to encourage people to really stop thinking about decaf as this really narrow item on our menu that is kind of an afterthought and that you only drink if you absolutely had to, if your doctor made you. Decaf coffee, if it's really good, means that all of us could be drinking more coffee. And isn't that the goal of opening a roastery and roasting coffee for customers? We want our customers to drink more of it. So if we have more options for a wider audience of people, I think that is a good thing. So pay attention to this series. We're going to do 3 roast-alongs, which will each be their own videos. And again, sharing the sample roast from that Mexico and those 2 Colombias, and then the profile roast. And I'll talk about how I developed those profiles, and we'll share the roast curves, and I'll share my tasting notes. And I think you'll be able to order at least one of those decafs from our website. I'm here to tell you to drink more coffee, drink more decaf coffee, and roast really good decaf coffee because it's out there and it's stellar, and I'm really excited about it. So thanks for watching, and we'll be back soon with our first roast-along video. Bye.